Let's talk about the Daleks. It's in a way beyond belief there's still anything to talk about given how much has been said about the Pepper Potts over the last 6 decades. No part of Doctor Who's history and legacy has received anything like as much discourse. Their place among science fiction's most iconic villains and as the most instantly recognisable element of Doctor Who are forever assured. So, what else is there to say? Well, I'm going to try and find out, as the review guide today begins a 60-year trek through every Dalek story in Classic and New Who. Obviously, this isn't just every story in which they appear, but every story based around them. For instance, the Series 5 finale doesn't count, as their role is just one of a number of villains, but Frontier and Space does, as they are the main driving force behind the story. Once we reach a point that can be reasonably called the end, which would be either the Daleks if no more Dalek stories are made between now and then, I've got no idea how long this will actually take, so no idea if that's likely or not, I'll be doing an overall look at the Daleks' influence and legacy on Doctor Who as a whole. But to end, we must first begin. It therefore brings us to the Daleks, which is what I'm going to refer to this story as because that's what it's called. The Mutants is a Pertwee story. Get over it. This is a very good pick for the most important story in the show's history. As I said, I'll do a separate video looking at the ins and outs of all this, but let's face it, if Terry Nation hadn't fought up the Daleks when he did, Doctor Who would have been cancelled after 2 or 3 seasons, his staff or any of it would have survived junking, and it would be totally forgotten today. The allure of the Daleks is what first drew in the viewership and the fanbase. So everything I say should be taken with the caveat that whatever the story does right and wrong, it got absolutely the most important thing right. It hooked the audience in and gave Doctor Who the steam to become what it is today. I might criticise elements of it, but all of that is with the astonishing achievement these 7 episodes have nearly all of the responsibility for. If you're a fan of the story and that bit worried you, then fear not, this review will mostly be a positive one. There are problems with it, and they will be given their fair share, but there's a great deal of good as well that will be given its time as well. And also, a lot of the flaws come from the fact that this was still a show very much going through its growing pains, and hey, that means some things don't quite work. Shows these days sometimes take years to hit their stride, but Doctor Who was doing this one in its 2nd and 3rd months on the air as a credit to it. So, I'm going to be my usual grumpy arsehole self, but that caveat should be in mind. Anyway, enough pointless stalling, let's look at the Daleks. I'll start with the non-writing stuff. As I've already said in the previous reviews, my interest is mostly in writing and the production side of things is less of a speciality, but it does need to be looked at, so here we are. The Daleks is that beast that was reasonably common in the 60s, but basically unheard of in any other era of the show. It has a story with more than one director. Christopher Barry directed all of the first 5 episodes except for episode 3, while Richard Martin directed episodes 3, 6 and 7. Barry had a long career in Who, which included several very fondly remembered stories, including The Romans, The Power of the Daleks, The Demons and The Brain of Morbius. Martin is best remembered for directing The Web Planet. Anyone got any Vaseline? To be fair to Martin, it's not all he did, and the rest of his Who resume does have some decent points as well, but unfortunately, if you blanked out the director's credit at the end of each episode and told me which episodes were directed by a respected Who grandee and which episodes were directed by the bloke who decided if there's one thing an alien planet needs, it's petroleum jelly on the lens, I'd probably have guessed without much issue. The Martin directed episodes aren't bad, but they're just quite sedate, and nothing very interesting is done, they just sort of chug along and that's it. It doesn't entirely help that the scripts for his episodes are a bit weaker, episode 3 sort of bridging the gap between the setup and the main plot, while episodes 6 and 7 just sort of run out of steam and waste time, but we'll get to that. Unfortunately, Martin doesn't really help this at all though. Even scenes that should have some tension or excitement on paper just don't translate at all. In most of the cave sequences in episodes 6 and 7, I was practically yawning with how dull they were. Again, some of this was the script, but how pedestrian the directing was doesn't help. Compare this to the Barry episodes, which frankly couldn't have been a better early advertisement for the show than they are. Again, the scripts were stronger, the drama and most of the regulars dying of radiation sickness while Susan crosses a wasteland to save them is rather more potent than bland fouls arguing and going through a glorified Go Ape course, but Barry presents them in such a way to elevate them. Especially considering this is a jungle set in a fairly small room, it's impressive how much tension Barry is able to create out of Carole and Ford running around it. Or earlier on when they're all exploring the city, the way it's shot enhances the uneasy and claustrophobic nature of what they've come across. You get the idea coming down here was a very bad mistake with very minimal dialogue. Overall, Barry contributes to the very effective eeriness of these early episodes. His episodes aren't perfect, mind. What comes to mind is the Dalek ambush of the Fowls in episode 4, where the whole thing kind of hinges on Ian being too late to warn them, but the staging makes it look like he's not too late, he's just kind of hanging around for a bit instead of coming right out, so that was a bit of a mistake. But yeah, mostly the Barry episodes are very well directed and contribute to the very effective atmosphere the first half or so the story creates. Also responsible for said atmosphere are the production and sound designers. Obviously Raymond Cusick's praises for creating the look of the Daleks have been sung aplenty over the years, but I'd also like to single out his work on other parts of the story. The forest, the city, even the caves from later on, they're all fantastically designed, especially considering the limitations in cost and scope there would have been on such a new show. The impression they must have made on the audience back on the original broadcast must surely have gone a long way in ensuring the show established itself as it did. The forest in particular looks fantastic, given it is basically just a bunch of props in a small room. The sound design is also phenomenal. The electronic soundtrack by Tristan Carey is astonishingly atmospheric and creepy, to the point where much of it was reused for several other 60s Dalek stories, and why not? The soundtracks of 60s Who go under the radar, I feel, and this one especially deserves more love. Would the Dalek reveal scene have had as much power if it wasn't for the soundtrack? I mean, don't get me wrong, I do love much of Murray Gold's work, but you know exactly the kind of music he would have put here and it would have completely ruined the scene. But yeah, the sound effects in general are fantastic, contributing so much to the atmosphere. Finally, bit of a trivia. Episode 1 has to be remounted due to the sounds made by the crew being audible on the soundtrack. The original first episode was junked and the only bit of it that survives is the reprise of the cliffhanger at the start of episode 2. The cliffhanger in the episode as it exists is much better than the one in the reprise, so my guess is we have the better end of the stick, but that's difficult to tell from just one clip. It's not that important, but missing episodes are an interest of mine, and I only get one chance to mention this, so I mentioned it. So, Terry Nation. It's funny really that a single story basically made him a very rich man for the rest of his life and set up his entire future sci-fi catalogue, but, well, if one has a very good idea like this, it doesn't feel too far out of the question, does it? I mean, the Daleks are a phenomenal idea, just astonishing. Creating a memorable and unique sci-fi villain out of a serious and potent allegory that allowed a writer to draw on his own experiences. Because with all that's happened with the Daleks over the last 60 years, the original concept has been somewhat lost in translation. I mean, let's be honest, this has basically nothing common with this story. Things change, of course, but let's examine what the Daleks originally were. Nation, of course, built them from his own experience as a child in wartime and what he knew about the Nazis, and then the subsequent fear of nuclear annihilation. The Daleks were both the allegory for the former, as seen in, well, more or less everything they say or do, while the general state of Skaro in the story and how this has affected both of its native species represent the latter. To examine the former, the Daleks represented the Nazis in several ways. Their rigid, machine-like conformity, for instance. One never gets a sense from the Daleks as there's any room for dissent or discussion. Obviously, in hindsight, it seems ridiculous to even say that, but as the establishment of a new enemy in a very new show, this was very important to establish. Then, of course, was the echoing of the Nazi obsession with racial purity, demonstrated through their attempt to destroy the Fowls, and best demonstrated with Ian's one line that I have a dislike for the unlike. A brilliant bit of dialogue, by the way, that summarises everything the audience needs to know, and with pretty good dramatic impact as well. Linking the Daleks to a threat that existed very much in the living memories of many of the viewers back then was a genius way of making the threat of the Daleks look more potent. The kids would be scared by the look on the voice, the adults by the fact that they remembered facing an enemy like this, only they were human beings, not irradiated blobs in a mini-tank. It's also to Nation's credit that he established early on through natural dialogue interactions that the Daleks aren't robots, and indeed we do see one at one point, which is a perfect way of getting that point across, but not too much in order to decrease the effectiveness of their main way of being presented. Their machine-like tendencies are a result of, well, being part machine, sure, but also because of how they think and feel in their Nazi-like way. There's a living being in there, which is acting like a machine nonetheless. Great pains are made to make this clear, and for very good reason. Anywho, the other part of the Daleks I mentioned relates to their present experience as it was in the 60s. Doctor Who began its run over a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which, if your grasp of history lacks, is when the world was nearly obliterated in a nuclear Armageddon because of near-irreconcilable tensions between the West and Russia, something that would be completely unimaginable today. Here. Anyway, the fear of nuclear annihilation and the radiation making life for the survivors pretty short and miserable was extremely potent at the time of broadcast, and the Daleks uses this as an important parallel. Skaro was destroyed by a nuclear war, and radiation has mutated the Daleks. Given the fear of nuclear war, the Daleks gave a worrying glimpse into a possible future. That's, in my view at least, part of what made them so effective at the time. What also makes the Daleks so effective is, and I'm going to briefly brief the production design back into it again, is that they are so unique and so unlike anything that had been seen before. It would have been so easy just to make them as the bog-standard sci-fi robots everyone had seen a million times before, but Nation's conception of them and Cusick's transformation of that conception into what we see on the screen is utterly gripping, and well, their longevity is proof of that if anywhere needed. The voices, the movement, and indeed the things they say and do, they all combine to create an experience which must have been unforgettably creepy back then. Even now, for that time and the obviously datedness of this production, much of that air is still retained. Their two introductions perfectly demonstrate this. Barbara, lost in the alien city with the tension rising with every moment, is suddenly ambushed by a toilet plunger. It sounds ridiculous, but, and full credit goes to Nation for concocting this encounter, Barry for realising it on the screen, and Jacqueline Hill for selling the hell out of it, it's a genuinely shocking moment. There's something in this city, and it's very alien. Boom, cliffhanger. Absolute genius. Their second introduction comes early in episode 2. As the situation has become more grim, the three other regulars are suddenly confronted by the Daleks for the first time. The slow pullback revealing so many of them with their unnatural movements and those voices, followed by proving to poor old Ian that they are indeed very dangerous. Their appearance, despite breaking the lonely claustrophobia of the city, only ups the tension further. Throughout the story, the Daleks are demonstrated as both intelligent and ruthless. As of point A, this is a side of the Daleks I think has been lost over the years, and I'm including the later classic years just as much as New Who in this, but throughout this story they're manipulative schemers, especially in the first 4 episodes or so, when they expertly manipulate both the regulars and the fouls to get them precisely where they want. Too often throughout the years the Daleks have just been loud, shouty tanks, and much of this intelligence has been lost. I'll have plenty of time to examine this over future stories, of course. As for the ruthlessness, well, the Daleks, their total xenophobia does lend itself to ruthlessness, does it not? It's also an interesting contrast with the fouls, whose useless pacifism makes them pretty pathetic in comparison, and yet, once they realise sitting around and letting themselves be destroyed isn't the best plan they've ever had, they can use their own advantages to defeat them. By hitting them with things, yeah, we'll get to the ending. The point is, the message is really that xenophobia and ruthlessness leads them to be paranoid, and that paranoia leads them into the conflict that results in their destruction. Remember, the fouls were willing to coexist, but their hands were forced by the unwillingness of the Daleks themselves. It's a good way of showing the Daleks are effective villains, intelligent and cunning, but also that their xenophobia and ruthlessness are their Achilles heel, really. I feel this is kind of another thing that's been lost over the years. After all, they've created an enormous universe-spanning empire as a result of wanting to destroy everything, and have nearly succeeded at this on multiple occasions, only really failing because the MacGuffins pulled out of Russell T Davies' arse, rather than their own nature failing them like here. Of course, there are other early elements here I'm glad didn't go the distance. Some of the lines they have are pretty silly in hindsight.
We can also supply unlimited quantities of fresh vegetables.
And the image of a Dalek carrying in a tray with some food on it is an utterly hilarious image. Would Sir like some whiskey as well? But, early installment weirdness is a thing. This is forgivable. What's less forgivable are some of the logical hiccups. Why would the Daleks even have the provision to create any food? Like, it's explained how, but not why, apart from they need to do it in the confines of the plot. And they keep the Doctor and Susan alive towards the end of the story so they can exposit to them, and because the plot requires it. And of course the ending in general, but as I said, we'll get to that. So overall, it's not hard to see why the Daleks took off in the way they did. The look and the sound created a fascinating first impression, and their effectiveness in the way they were written as the villains did the rest. While nobody could have predicted their becoming a worldwide phenomenon for 60 years, I don't think anyone could have faulted you if you predicted something big was happening here. The second thing they needed to get right here in these early days were the character dynamics between the regulars. This had been, in my view, the only effective part of the back 3 episodes of the first story, and this has continued in great fashion here. The first episode is essentially dedicated to this. The good thing about long stories is that they do have time to pace themselves to character moments, and especially considering we were still very much in the show's growing pains, it's all the more appreciated. In these opening scenes we establish the Doctor's antagonism with Ian and Barbara's dependence on each other, and the question of whether they should trust the Doctor, and of course Susan's role as a bridge between her grandfather and the teachers. The plot in these early scenes is in fact entirely driven by these interactions. It would have been easy just to pointlessly exposit, but everything they find is a means to establish character. For instance, when they find the metallic creature, they easily could have just exposited about it, but Nation uses it to establish that while the Doctor is a grumpy prat, he also has a consistent worldview based on his knowledge and intelligence, and his respect for those traits. Just that from a few sentences, really. Indeed, the plot entirely comes about because of negative character traits of the Doctor, specifically his iron stubbornness and desire to one-up Ian, which causes him to pull the trick on the Mercury, making them go and look at the city. It shows his character flaws right out and open for the viewer, and to prove the fears that Ian has had throughout the episode right, that he will put them in danger for his pride. Not only that, though, is to set up the conflict between himself and Ian. Later on, while they're suffering from the radiation poisoning, he's cross with Doctor, with the subtext being, "Serves you right, you stupid old twat." While Barbara is more concerned, this again shows their differences. While they do rely on each other by being so far out of their element, Barbara is the more forgiving of the two, while Ian's unable to forget his tensions with the Doctor. They're not the same at all, and this is what makes them such an effective pairing. I think it's also possible to see in Ian regret he was not more forceful in opposing the Doctor's idiocy and taking them down to the city in the first place, and projecting that onto the Doctor himself. Even Susan, who unfortunately did not receive an enormous amount of development as a character throughout her run, as the writers simply didn't really know what to do with her and Carole and Ford got sick of being there to scream and exposit and left before they could work it out, does get her fair share in this episode. She starts off very much as she would be, screaming at innocuous things and generally being the least effective of the 4, until they're all dying in a city of radiation poisoning, and they need to get the drugs left for them by a mysterious shadowy figure, trademark. Ian got his legs blasted by the Daleks and the Doctor and Barbara are too weak from the radiation, so it does have to be Susan to go, through a pretty miserable jungle, on her own, and she earlier lost her shit over feeling like someone might have touched her. Admittedly, this does feel a bit more contrived than it needs to be. If it had just been as I described it above, it would have been a lot better, but unfortunately Nation felt the need to add some rubbish about the key for the TARDIS needs to be inserted a certain way to work, which obviously Ian and Barbara don't know, a problem that has never once come up again over the last 60 years, and good thing too, given the number of people who try to use it. It just adds complication to something that didn't need it, but arguably the finer details aren't really the point. It's a brilliant draw for the viewer, done entirely through character. Susan has to make this journey regardless of whether she, the rest of the regulars, or indeed the audience wants her to. It also ends episode 2 on a fantastic cliffhanger. She arrives in the safety of the TARDIS, grabs the drugs, and then looks at the unpleasantness outside, knowing she's only halfway done. The episode ends as she leaves. But it also works because Susan, in this story at least, is changed because of it. Mostly screamy Susan is still very much there and with us, but she does become more confident and more able. Her journey has led her from weeping over being touched on the shoulder to willingly going with a Dalek to arrange a foul meeting. In fact, she's able to use her earlier behaviour as a ruse in order to trick a Dalek into pissing off and leaving them alone while they're escaping. It's a shame that other writers tended just to use her as they did, as there was potential in the character that was just never really realised. There are plenty of moments that do well to build characters for the 4 regulars throughout the story, but the one I'd like to highlight the most is when they're planning their escape in episode 3, imaginatively titled The Escape. Essentially, they're able to use the pre-existing antagonism to fool the Daleks into thinking they're not doing anything except bickering, but they've already grown beyond that. It's a small thing really, but such an important one in my view. Not only have they moved beyond those antagonisms, the story is able to use that as a fact to advantage the plot. Hell, even later when they have to leave Ian and the Dalek shell behind, he and the Doctor quickly agree it's the best plan. The hostility between the two of them is never entirely gone, but here it's evaporating under the necessity of cooperation and escape. But that's not quite it. The need to get the Fowls to grow a pair later on also opens up rifts between them. While they've grown, it's not gone all the way yet. So yeah, honestly this is my favourite aspect of the story. As important as setting up the Daleks as the villains were, setting up the character dynamics of our regulars this early in the series run was absolutely vital. And in those crucial early episodes when there are a few other non-Dalek characters, Nation absolutely knocks this out the park. Making the show into a success required making these characters work, and much of why they do was done here in this story. The last major thing I'd like to highlight is how well the plot, at least in the first 4 to 5 episodes or so, is structured. Not that it's flawless, episode 1 wastes a lot of time on that stupid food machine stuff, which definitely feels like the show going through its growing pains, but it's mostly very focused and flows excellently. Every major plot point is set up, developed, but then leads into the next one. There's very little dead time. There's rarely any exposition that just solves a plot point without bringing up a new one to be explored. It effortlessly goes from exploring the city to being captured, to getting the radiation drugs, to escaping, to finding the Fowls to prevent the ambush, trying to convince the Fowls to fight back. It's astonishing how well it flows. Yeah, there's some padding, it's 7 episodes, what do you expect? But considering everything, it is kept to a minimum. There's not really much to say here, the plot's really well structured. That's all there is really to say. Unfortunately though, this isn't a flawless piece. Most of the flaws are small and forgivable, like some minor logical hiccups I'm not going to waste time by going into, but there are 2 large ones that unfortunately do bring the story down. The first is that you may have noticed that I've frequently been referring to the first 4 or 5 episodes when it comes to positive stuff for this story, because unfortunately the quality does take a bit of a nosedive midway through episode 5, when the well-structured, character-driven, claustrophobic and creepy piece is replaced by some cheesy B-movie adventure as they go through the jungles and caves to get into the city. It's not actively terrible or anything, but it is uneventful, dull and unimaginative. As we'll get to, the Fowls aren't interesting enough to carry this, and the Daleks go from manipulative schemers to, we're going to explode a bomb, and then spending the whole time saying, we're going to explode it, yes we are, just not yet, of course. The narrative drive is completely lost. Instead of effortlessly going from one plot driver to another, we're stuck with get into the city for an hour in a way that simply goes absolutely nowhere. They set off to enter the city, and then after them shenanigans, they get into the city. We don't really learn anyone about anyone's character. Oh sure, cowardly Fowl gets to complain, then pointlessly sacrifice himself, but we never really cared about him to begin with, and these scenes do nothing really to change that. There's no real tension to any of it, and the sophistication and nuance of the early episodes is gone. As I said, it's not unwatchably bad. I'd gladly watch these episodes over any of the Web Planet, for instance, but it does feel like it's just there to pad out the length to 7 episodes, almost as if Nation ran out of plot around episode 5 and then went, oh shit. It's understandable, and long stories that can make excellent use of every minute of their length are the exception, not the norm, but it is a disappointment given how good the early episodes were. This culminates in the final battle, which is the biggest letdown of the entire story. The Fowls run in and start beating the Daleks to death. To say this is an anticlimax is an understatement. It's only really one step above them coming in and tickling the Daleks to death, for God's sake. For a villain that's been such a threat throughout the story, to be defeated so pathetically is definitely a massive point against it. It does have a good moment where the Doctor, faced with a Dalek pleading for help, says regretfully that even if he wanted to, he couldn't. That's a good line, one that contributes to the foundation of the Doctor's moral view, and brilliantly delivered by Hartnell, but overall, this finale is a big disappointment. The second problem I understand rather less. The Fowls are the other major element of the story apart from the Daleks, and they're about as interesting as a chartered accountant wandering through a paint drying convention. They are bland, with tepid character interactions reflecting the basic surface level characteristics they've been imbued with. There's the noble, proud leader who obviously gets offed early on, the younger up-and-comer who has to prove himself, the coward who learns bravery just before he pointlessly sacrifices himself, and of course, the woman, because it's the 60s and we're not allowed to have interesting female characters yet. And yeah, this is about as interesting as I make it sound. Any good stuff with the files entirely comes from the interaction with the regulars. The scene where Ian shows Aladdin, yeah, and their names are very silly, that's another thing. That pacifism means he can just steal their women, it makes more sense in context, which naturally ends with Ian getting decked in the face, is a great one, but it entirely comes from the impetus of Ian and the other regulars. Doesn't seem to be much in the way of character growth for any of the Fowls for this, or anything really, frankly, apart from superficial things like Coward Fowl deciding to sacrifice himself and the doll going over the ledge scene. One Fowl had a romance with Barbara, apparently. I honestly didn't even notice it was happening until they talked about it literally in the final scene of the story, which shows how successful that was. This unfortunately does become a bit of a recurring theme with Nation pen stories, with a few notable exceptions, but it's fairly clear developing supporting characters was not something he enjoyed, and when Nation doesn't enjoy doing something in his writing, he half-asses it. This is something I'll look at when we get to later stories, but yeah, the Fowls here are boring as hell. One interpretation I've managed to get out of the Fowls story here is that this might be a kind of a commentary on the appeasement of the Western powers of the Nazis before the Second World War. Their pacifism is clearly serving the Daleks and not themselves, and they have to be forced into action to defeat them. Perhaps I'm looking too strongly into this, but that is my interpretation of it. If this was the intention, I kind of wish this had been explored a bit more, because it's only really surface level stuff, and as I said, clearly the Fowls aren't really interesting enough to exploit it, but I think it's interesting enough to note. Although, amusingly, they do show this as what an ancient fowl looks like. It's so funny how completely incompatible this is with Genesis of the Daleks, written by the same Mr. T Nation, it should be noted. It's funny how the fans of so many other sci-fi franchises wet the bed over minor continuity gaffes, while us Doctor Who fans just look at completely incompatible shit like this and just shrug and nod. Final score for the Daleks is 6 out of 10. I'd say overall it's slightly above average for Classic Who. It is dragged down by the much weaker last few episodes, which pull it back from the 7 or 8 the opening instalments deserve, and there is quite a bit of evidence this was still a show very much in its growing pains, but the fantastic realisation of the Daleks themselves, the great character work, and the effectiveness of the first half or so of the story rises this above the Classic Who average, which is a good average to rise above, of course. Seen with the eyes of 6 decades, it has got its holes, but it's also very easy to see how it launched its villains into becoming a phenomenon.